I'm Philip Michael Sherman for Marginalia Review of Books. We are on the campus of Maryville College in Maryville, Tennessee, where Dr. Erin Darby is this year's 10th anniversary Bible Grant speaker. Dr. Darby is Assistant Professor of Religion at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville and an expert on Judean pillar figurines. Welcome.
Thank you.
So, the most obvious question. Can you say a little bit about what Judean pillar figurines are, where they've been discovered, and when they were in use?
Broadly speaking, Judean pillar figurines are small clay females. The base is a pillar, that's the name, and there's usually breasts, hands on or under the breasts. There are two styles of heads. There's a molded face, and then there's a pinched face, just with the finger impressions. So they're found in almost every major city in Judah, especially in the 8th through 6th centuries. And that's one of the strange things about them. They appear sort of out of nowhere in the 8th century, let's give it late 9th. And then they're gone with the destruction of the Jerusalem temple. And of course there are people who are working through the details of that chronology, but more or less it's held for a very long period of time. So what made me really interested is that one of the most numerous ritual objects doesn't appear to have any textual attestation in the biblical corpus, and we still don't really understand them. So I thought, aha, something to write a book about.
So these have been known for a while.
Yeah.
And scholars have proffered a lot of theories as to what they are. And in your book, you sort of take on some of these theories at the very beginning to say these are ways that have been used to understand these texts, these objects, which perhaps haven't been very helpful in the past. What were some of those understandings of these objects?
Well, so to be clear, when I started the project, it was important that I didn't just offer yet another theory, and perhaps some people will think that's just what I've done. But I at least attempted not to do that. What I was interested in is how we derived these theories. So for example, why do we assume that the figurines relate to females? Because the figurine form is associated with an iconic type of a female, ergo it had to be used by a female. And there are a variety of interpretations like that. So it's an image. It's clearly not of the Israelite God, so ergo it must be in competition with God, or it must be God's wife. And I thought we could be more rigorous. So even if what we give up in the process is, I suggest some options that I think might have current support given the data at hand, I think really what I was hoping for was for all of us to ask better questions about how we would verify these theories. So you think it might be a goddess. Okay, what would we look for? How would we know? I have a colleague who said, well, maybe they are representations of maturing older women who have taken care of your offspring. And I said, okay, that's an interesting idea. How would I test it? What would I look for? What data would I bring to bear? Because otherwise, we're guessing. And we're guessing on not a whole lot.
So your work is pretty grounded in trying to think about sort of methodology we use to get at this.
Yeah, or at least I tried. I tried.
Well, it was compelling, I thought, because you take out pretty early on this notion that these are probably likely to be divine figures, or at least that they are not known named.
Right, major divine figures like a major goddess of a pantheon.
Right, which had been a fairly dominant theory.
Yeah, and remains a dominant theory.
So what kinds of, from a methodological perspective, what kinds of data do you draw in then to try to understand something that's not got any inscriptional evidence on it, isn't mentioned in the biblical corpus?
Right.
What do you look for?
Well, so I started actually from the modern rather than the ancient. I started with what are the theories people have and how would I test them to see if they hold. So honestly, at the end of the day, if someone found a pillar figurine tomorrow, it said this is Asherah, I have no problem with that. What I have a problem with is until we have enough data, saying something that is more than we really can say. So I started making lists of what kinds of material I would look at to even assess the plausibility of that kind. Let's take the goddess interpretation. And Carol Myers had pointed out already in 2007 that the fact that they're made of clay and they lack clear iconographic symbols that we might expect if it was a major deity was a mitigating factor against them being interpreted as main goddesses. And I found that very persuasive. And she's not the only one. A number of people have puzzled about why, if it's such an important goddess, it doesn't have any connection, or much of a connection, to known iconography or iconographic styles. Now, some people have attempted to explain the pillar itself, right, as an iconic symbol of trees, which then, based on what I find to be a fairly convoluted argument that Asherah in the Bible is somehow related to tree iconography, would be the linchpin connecting Judean pillar figurines with Asherah. I don't think that's a particularly strong argument. I don't really, one way or the other, have a dog in that fight. I just don't think we should say it until it makes sense. And then when I started looking at figurine rituals in general, it didn't seem to me that, on average, the main deities of the pantheons, wherever the figurine ritual took place, were the ones being represented in clay. It was almost always, they're in the ritual, but not the thing that you're depicting in the ritual.
And this was an interesting part of your argument that I stayed with for a while, that the actual medium of this object itself could have theological valence.
I didn't realize I was going there until I was there. And then I thought, okay, well, but again, I'm not the first person to note that a material out of which an object is made might matter. I think that hasn't been a prominent part of our conversations about Judean pillar figurines, because I think what happens is we're so data starved for religion on the ground. Whatever, I mean, Bill Deaver has tried to claim that we have a lot of data, but honestly, I mean, we may have some, better than the Iron One, but it's not a lot.
And one of the things that struck me, you're right, the dearth of the kinds of data that we would like to have, but also this question of inherently wanting to see a conflict there because of the nature of the biblical text.
Right, well, it's sexy and it's interesting, and sometimes when you read older scholarship on the figurines, you get the sense that they want to find, as you said, something to be in competition with Yahweh, or they're buying into the Deuteronomistic argument that the Baals and the Asherahs, etc., were somehow prevalent, and so, aha, here's a word in a Bible, here's a thing that we don't know what it is, let's put them together, and now we have an Asherah. There is a sense, at least in my reading of texts, that people want this to be the case. And what's interesting is people want opposite things. So some feminists really want this to be the key to unlock what is otherwise a fairly veiled aspect of Israelite religion, that is women's experience. And while I'm personally, that's my background, that's where I come from, right? I studied with Carol Myers, so I clearly care about women's religion. But I couldn't find any good data that backed that interpretation up, or rather there were so many problems with it, so many questions left unanswered, I just don't think we can go there. So on one hand, they do that. On the other hand, people have used them to say, oh, look how ridiculous this is, or it's unorthodox or inappropriate, or clearly normative Yahwism would have had a problem with this, or there's this sort of obsession, especially in the first half of the 20th century scholarship, with fertility, and it's illicit and problematic, and we like that, and we want that to be there. So they end up being a cipher. They really do what people want them to do, depending on what their argument is, which is interesting.
So then you finally settle on these Neo-Assyrian texts. Like you make the observation that however we explain these, they appear and they disappear at about the same time that Judah is under the control of Assyrian powers. It's beyond that. What are those texts? How do you use them? How do they help you get better purchase on perhaps what these objects were in a Judean context?
So, and this has been, for some people, this is the most controversial part, if you can say an academic book is controversial. This is the most controversial part of the book. And I was worried about going to the New-Syrian corpus because I am very concerned about how we do comparison in biblical studies. And I'm very aware of how that's not been done well in the past. So I think if we think of it from this direction, it will help. People are already forming models that they use to interpret figurines, because the figurines don't have enough information. So you're having to bring something else to bear. For some people, it's the Bible. For other people, it's ethnographic studies of how figurines have been used in other societies. Either way, you are bringing an interpretive framework. And so if we have all of these figurine texts, and the Neo-Assyrian ones have the best chronological range for our purposes, but Egypt has them as well, so do the Hittites. So we have figurine rituals. They're not Judean pillar figurines, absolutely not. But if what we're interested in is forming a better model for how we go from here is this thing I dug up in the ground to these are the possible interpretations of it, then we can use the Neo-Assyrian texts to form a kind of set of questions we can ask ourselves. Well, why do I assume, just because I have a figurine, that this figurine was the thing that the person using it prayed to? Where does that assumption come from? Is that a grounded assumption? Well, it turns out that at least in the Neo-Assyrian corpus, the prayers are to the main deities and the figurines are often other entities. So clearly I can't assume that. I would need more evidence to make that assumption. Or why do I assume that because a figurine has certain iconographic features, those features are meant to depict the population using the figurine? It doesn't say that, right? That's an assumption I bring to bear. And so when you look at the Neo-Assyrian text, what you can see is that there appears to be, most of the time, very little connection between the depiction itself and the audience using the figurine. So I can't make that assumption. I would need more data to say that. That's how I ended up approaching it. It was just kind of a weird ethno-archaeological way of dealing with ancient texts. So that's one part of the argument. The other side, however, is, as you noted, they rise and fall at the time when Judah is under Assyrian domination. Now, I'm not the first person to say that, right? Ryan Byrne has said that, Ian Wilson has said that. So people have noticed that confluence. But the way it's been discussed up until now implies that the Judeans were just simply resisting an encroaching Assyrian power. And that's what I wanted to problematize, because we don't have the evidence to say that either. So I was interested in thinking more about how the empire was facilitating the rise of figurine rituals, or at least their popularity in the period, rather than thinking of Judeans are adopting Neo-Assyrian practice, because I don't think we can say that's what happened. In fact, technically speaking, it's just as possible that Neo-Assyrians were exposed to apotropaic figurine rituals when they were out on campaign, and that helped undergird the popularity of small miniature Neo-Assyrian apotropaics in. And
we simply have better textual documentation.
Right. So if you that's right. So I don't want to say that Judeans are borrowing Neo-Assyrian practice. I think that is way too simple. But I do think that you have an explosion of figurines during the time where you have an imperial system for the transmission of ideas and practices, and that you see it not just in Judah, you see it everywhere.
So to ask about this iconographic trajectory,
yeah.
So how are some of the ways naked females were pictured then during this time period in the ancient Near East, and what's unique then about their depiction in these Judean pillar figures?
Well, the first thing to me, and they seemed so familiar to me at first, so I had to go through this process of making them seem less familiar because I'd spent too much time thinking about them. So when you look at other depictions of females, let's take Egypt for example, the females are depicted entirely from head to toe, not with a pillar base, but and the bottoms are, sometimes the sheath dress is so thin that you can even see the basic human anatomy underneath. So the fact that we have this sort of pillar tradition was interesting to me. Where did it come from? How did it get here? It's not the way we had traditionally depicted figurines even in Palestine, Israel. And people make a lot about the size of the breasts. Well, breasts vary. Every woman in the world knows that. And so I got a little tired listening to everyone talk about the prominent breasts, because it's not like that's the only thing on the figurine. And in fact, I was far more interested in other questions like, why do Judean pillar figurines appear to have what is an old Babylonian style wig? Or not Babylonian, Egyptian style wig. And how does that end up in the iconographic repertoire of the 8th century? So, so those were it was the pieces, not just the breast, but the whole thing, all of the individual parts and their combination that I thought really was unique about the corpus in Judah. At the same time, not so unique, because pillar figurines of different varieties, solid, bell-shaped, are in Israel, they're in Philistia, they're in Ammon, they're in Moab. And so part of the problem with, I think, the way people have addressed Judean pillar figurines is they don't think of them as part of a Levantine process. And they are distinctive, but they're not distinctive because they're pillars. They're distinctive for a variety of stylistic features. And that mattered to me as well. So it wasn't just their distinctiveness, it was their distinctiveness within a larger corpus that I thought was very interesting. And it wasn't just the thing everybody cares about, the breasts. It was also the combination of individual parts that I think is, tells us something different is going on.
So I guess I should ask then, so your best guess, your best offer on the basis of all this data now is what? How are these figures used? Why did they become so significant and so important when they did?
So it's I'm doing my best to answer that question. And actually I have a few interlocutors who have taken me to task for not caring more about that, or at least not having a stronger statement. So I think, first of all, we base our interpretations on the data currently available. This is an excavatable object, which means that any excavation tomorrow or 10 years from now can change the playing field. So my opinion is based on the widest amount of information that I had access to. It seems like we're safe if we say that they're used for protection and healing. We have good textual attestation that figurines all over the empire in this period were used for those and related purposes. We have some reason to believe that already in the late Bronze period, female images, either in text or in iconography, were associated with healing practices. We have a number of female images appended to the outsides of shrine boxes, cult stands, that, along with other apotropaic images, seem to suggest a protective function. We have female images, not Judean pillar figurines, but females, on horse trappings and seals owned by males, and in contexts that the common denominator would be more protection than fertility to build a family. We have the rise of plagues in the 9th and 8th centuries in at least the imperial center, if not the hinterland. So we have reasons to think that for me, the increased urbanization, the contacts between peoples, Judean pillar figurines are in a way an urban phenomenon. People will talk about them as a kind of Judean fertility female out in the middle of the wilderness, we need to make a lot of babies thing. But actually, they're most populous in cities. So all of those pieces added up to me that I think healing and protection is a really good option here, and that these figurines may represent semi-divine entities. There's no reason that they would need to represent high gods or goddesses.
And so your idea is that they would have functioned as an intermediary to Yahweh as a way of appealing.
Well, and I don't know to Yahweh, to any deity. I'm not even going to get into what the pantheon looked like in general, right? I think that both Ted Lewis and Mark Smith have done an outstanding job, and Zioni Zevet have done a great job complicating for us what ancient pantheons looked like and how more complicated, and suggesting they're harder than we think.
And I thought one of the things that struck out to me was your use of even the Ugaritic material there for this notion from Kirta. Right. Where he pinches off about a piece of clay and creates this sort of unknown goddess outside of this particular context.
Right.
Who functions this way for.
And I was shocked. I hadn't read a lot of reference to this material, any of the textual material, the figurine rituals or the Shatakatu episode, in relation to figurines. It wasn't stuff people were talking about. And so I came across it, I think in someone's dissertation they mentioned it, and then Ted Lewis refers to it briefly in a little piece he did on ancient Israelite iconography. So I took that as a really important piece of data, and it just so happens that at the same time, Ted was in the process of producing a sort of critical edition of the translation of that text and its treatment for, I think it's the Journal of Near Eastern Religion. It just came out in 2013 and 2014. So it was actually a really interesting time for us both to be working on that text, and I was so happy that he, as a textual expert, was providing that independently. So if you haven't read that, go read it, because his treatment in 2 articles is great. And he was very kindly willing to share that with me as I was preparing my monograph. But I didn't know breast milk was a major part of Egyptian spell literature. I mean, that wasn't maybe major. I don't know. It's a part of, right? There were just bringing different pieces of evidence together to think about this was, I think, for me, one of the most important parts of the process. Trying to get people, and the book is trying to do that, trying to get people to talk to each other that don't often talk to each other.
And that was one of the things that struck me in reading the book, that there were, almost by chapter, different forms of biblical scholarship taking place. And I came away from it thinking, okay, so here are these charts and graphs of analysis of the clay. And
I was made up. A lot of people made fun of me for those charts.
No, I came away from thinking that's biblical scholarship too, in a way that perhaps it doesn't occur to everyone to think that that's a key component. And then there's an entire chapter looking at clay and language about clay in the Hebrew Bible, and then these broader methodological questions. And yeah, you're right, it's almost like there aren't always enough people in the room who are that intimately familiar with the data to start making those connections. And I thought this work did a great job of bringing those conversations together.
I mean, I live a weird double life as an archaeologist, but also as someone who's trained in the text. And that changes my perspective on things. And on both sides of that equation, we have a hard time talking to each other. You know, text people are rightly very intimidated by archaeological publications. I mean, they're hard, they're impenetrable, they're jargony, they're difficult to read. 9 times out of 10, what do people do? They flip to the conclusion section and past all those horrible charts. And it turns out that it's actually really difficult to interpret material culture. You don't just look at how a figurine appears. You have to look at what, were there ethnobotanical or paleobotanical remains in the same room? Was the room exposed to human intervention after the house went out of use? All of that really boring stuff actually has a pretty big impact on how we interpret archaeological finds. So on one side, I understand why people don't want to engage all of that. On the other side, archaeologists are not always as educated about the textual tradition, its history, its redaction, the problems with interpretation or the translation, as maybe they ought to be as well. So what I was hoping to do is bring a lot of people to the table. We'll see if it works.